Well, she made national headlines back in 2017 after being kidnapped by her teacher when she was just a high school student.
And now Elizabeth Thomas is among those supporting her brother, who was just found guilty of trying to cover up accusations of rape.
Our chief investigative reporter Jeremy Finley has the latest on a story he first broke 6 years ago.
Tonight, James Thomas is spending his last few weeks as a free man before heading to federal prison after being sentenced Friday to 15 months for obstruction of justice, found guilty of trying to cover up accusations that he raped this female inmate while he was a correctional officer at the Murray County Jail.
Oftentimes in obstruction cases, a defendant's his whole point is to thwart the investigation of the underlying allegation.
Thomas, who legally changed his last name to Justice, was named the caretaker of his sister Elizabeth when she was rescued after being kidnapped by her teacher. WSMV4 investigates, then uncovered that this inmate not only accused him of raping her in 2016.
He is a sexual predator.
His fellow correctional officer told us he admitted to her that he'd done something that would send him to prison.
Why else would you make the statement that you could land in the federal penitentiary for what you've done?
After our story aired, a federal criminal investigation was launched, and prosecutors say James Justice then made false claims that he was ordered by his superiors at the jail not to document the inmate's sexual advances towards him. Those superiors then testified at trial that they never instructed him not to write the report.
The defendant took steps to obstruct the investigation by lying. We have to take that seriously.
Along with the appearance of his sister, who spoke with E! News last year about turning her kidnapping into a Lifetime movie, others wrote letters of support, including Murray County Sergeant Don Tilley, who wrote Thomas had unwavering integrity. Now, you may recall while facing the criminal charge of obstructing a federal investigation, we uncovered that James Thomas continued to work as a correctional officer, supervising male inmates, with the sheriff terminating him only after he was found guilty. Marius?
So, Jeremy, did Elizabeth Thomas say anything at the sentencing?
Marius, she did not. She sat with his supporters and his family. James Thomas did take the stand, though, saying that his whole life has changed, that his career is now ruined. He also did admit to having sex with the inmate, but only after she left prison. Marius?
Jeremy Finley, thank you so much.